Welcome to Last Train Home, a brand new real-time strategy game with a whole load of elements thrown in the mix from tactics, survival, and resource management. The game itself set in a fever dream of a setting for me personally. You play as the Czechoslovak Professional Legion, trying to make your way home across the Trans-Siberian Railway and in the midst of a Russian civil war. Thank you so much to THQ Nordic for sponsoring this video and giving me an early access look at the game, which just released on November 28th. You can check it out using my link below. Now let's jump in and see what it delivers. And it's not just the setting that has me particularly excited as somewhat of an amateur Cold War European history historian. It's actually also about how this beautiful, sometimes honestly a little bit too good looking for its own liking, game plays out in reality. So we begin the game in a little bit of a precarious spot. As I say, we are playing as the Czechoslovak Legion, a professional legion who is unfortunately stranded inside of Russia. And with no clear allegiance throughout the Civil War, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the video, it obviously leads to some difficult decisions on how you approach each individual circumstance. The game itself, as you can see, at least in these missions, plays out like a real-time tactics game would. You control your little dudes, your soldiers, move them around the map, and every now and again, there are elements of story laced into it, largely leading into that fact that you are playing as a neutral party in a country torn apart by civil war and, of course, suffering from the long hangovers of its economic collapse, of the collapse of its ruling elite, and trying to form itself as a new nation. So there's a lot going on politically inside of this world. And that goes right down to the little details too. Before we talk about that broader story and everything else that involves this world, like controlling your train, like desperately trying to find fuel, let's focus in on the turn-based tactical fights for a moment. As you can see, you send in a squadron, size up to you, and of course skill set largely up to you as well. Each soldier will have a different role. As you level them up, they can have multiple roles. And of course, I'm controlling them, as you can see here, in real time, navigating my way around individual levels or settings, ultimately, of course, to try and reach an objective. And these objectives tend to be about either A, our survival, or B, trying to gather resources so that we can actually work our way along this 9,000 kilometer journey. And as you can see by the gameplay, each level varies quite a bit depending on the fixtures inside of the level, the weapons, the ammunition. But one thing that I like in particular, that I really want to highlight, is this pause function, what they call tactical view. Here, if the stress of real-time combat is just a little bit too overwhelming for you, like it can be for me sometimes, you can hit the spacebar, pause, take a breather, have a look at the situation, and then assign some moves. Now, obviously, all of this is happening while time is paused, so you can spend as much time as you like, making sure that your units are moving toward cover, maybe lining up a few shots across the way. My fan favorite move is to lob a grenade. Very successful, very impactful, and very easy to do. But putting that to one side, once you've assigned all of those different orders and made sure that your soldiers are healthy and in cover, something that, by the way, is very important because Last Train Home can be somewhat unforgiving from time to time, then your dudes can carry out their actions. And it's not just front face, come at me combat. There's also some other strategies, of course, you could enforce. You'll notice I'm walking around in kind of a stealth, silent mode in this mission here, attempting to sneak up on the enemy rather than go all guns blazing. And of course that presents its own strategies as well, such as something I'm quite a fan of, the stealth takedown, among many other things, laying traps, setting up equipment, finding resources on the map, you name it, it's got it. I think that it plays out very well, and that tactical view, for me anyway as a player, is a godsend. To just get a little bit of a break from what, as I've mentioned, can be somewhat stressful real-time strategic management. Putting that to one side though, and now that we've kind of covered off at least the basics of how this tactical gameplay plays out, let's now remind ourselves of the bigger picture here. Because it's not just about calling in artillery strikes on unsuspecting enemies or building up a strategic position within but one mission. There's a much broader goal going on here, and some very interesting development mechanics. At the end of each mission, as you can see, you get this, what will hopefully be a victory screen, although your results may vary. Now, inside of that, You'll get to review your squad, the objectives, and any equipment that you may have found. Moving through, you see some story elements start to play through. Again, with what I think, honestly, personally, is quite a nice aesthetic. You'll get to talk, maybe, with different characters that you've interacted with along the way. Potentially remember soldiers that you may have lost. And, of course, decide how exactly you'd like to honor their memory. Now, these decisions aren't just trivial. They are, of course, building up the broader story, that 9,000-kilometer journey, but they also impact your individual soldiers who form part of your squadrons. As I mentioned earlier, you can level them up, progress through, unlocking extra roles for them so each one can have kind of a dual role feature, as well as leveling up their personal attributes like dexterity or intelligence, which will, of course, in turn, impact exactly how they handle the different events in-game. Finally, things like resources and consumables can be used, from goulash to roasted meat to grilled fish, to ensure that your dudes are in top, fit, fighting shape, or alternatively, maybe not so much. Again, the decision is ultimately up to you how you handle each one of these individuals as part of what is, of course, the broader mission, the train itself, right? Literally, the namesake of the game, Last Train Home. And here we have much more of a resource management, almost kind of a base building theme. But of course, your base is on tracks and you're driving it all the way across Siberia. Now, inside of this base management, which again is mobile and agile, and so you'll have to be picking up fuel as you move through, you'll be able to upgrade the different carriages, allowing you to potentially pick up more soldiers to bring along with you on the journey, maybe different equipment like the artillery strike, for example, requiring a carriage on the train to be able to fire that bad boy. And when you step back into this more arena view or map view, you start to get a feeling for the broader world. Because of course, right up until now, we've been really focused down in on individual missions, individual squadrons. Here you can see the train's journey, controlling its speed and pacing while also sending out squadrons to carry out different missions. In this case, I'm sending them out to a small town, hoping to find somebody to trade with on the outskirts of the conflict and hopefully not draw myself into any danger. In this case, it's a bit of an old man. Is he senile? Maybe. Did we get some goods out of him? Quite possibly. So all in all, not too bad. You'll also find lots of other random things that you can explore along the way. They tend to be maybe opportunities to get food, right? A big one. Lakes, houses, you name it, plenty of places to grab it. Or alternatively, you might be looking for resources, not just fuel, but things to upgrade your train or keep your people alive. By the time you've finished doing all of these different missions, which, while they are side missions, you will have to engage with some of them, at least at the start. You're gonna need resources, and the train doesn't have an awful lot of fuel. So there's kind of that survival element playing out here as well. Keep up your team, keep everybody alive, and try as hard as you can to make it through to the next chapter in the story. Speaking of the story, I think it's worth noting a few different things. The scale of the story itself is divided across 9 chapters, the first one reaching its conclusion and moving your way through to the next one when you arrive in Moscow, one of the first stops and likely one of the more urban stops in your journey across Siberia. The story itself, in some instances, just honestly looks too good for what it should look like. This game has some beautiful cutscenes, and it's not just the way that they look, really painting the story and the characters too, by the way, but it's also the story that's being told behind the scenes. As I mentioned in the introduction, and on a personal level, it's a little bit of a fever dream for me, as an amateur historian interested in the Cold War, particularly interested in Europe and Eastern Europe. The setting here, it couldn't be a better fit. Now, on the technical side of things, because that may not be the same for you, I also wanted to pay a quick shout out to the difficulty settings, which approach, I think, real-time tactics in a much more useful way than many other titles. Here you can see there are individual modifiers to management, fuel and food consumption, train damage. There are also mission modifiers to the damage I receive or deal, how my soldiers behave when they're downed, and all kinds of auto pause functions that you can turn on or off depending on how you like to set it up. The customization as well, at the highest level in the difficulty presets, allows you to effectively auto-manage different elements of the game. So if you're interested in tactics, but not so much interested in the resource management, managing the train itself, then you can effectively kind of sideline that part and focus on what's important to you here in the difficulty settings. I think it's pretty cool, and I think it deserved a shout out. Another thing that you might be wondering is, how does the game run? How does it perform? And in my experience, again, somewhat in early access, but also after the game released on the 28th of November, I have to say, very well. I didn't have any performance problems. I ran into very few glitches. I think the worst thing that happened to me was in one mission, one of my soldiers got a bit stuck. But outside of that, I am pretty confident to say, at least in my experience, the game runs really well, and I can't fault it otherwise. It's a fairly seamless experience. And that's important, of course, because it's fundamental to how you might enjoy it. Another thing that I would like to highlight toward the end of this video is how I think it kind of brings everything together. A nice, perhaps, concluding point. On the one hand, there's a strong element here of just trying to survive. As I've mentioned many times, the story is a relatively difficult one. A neutral party, potentially holding the kind of moral role of protectors of the weak, but at the same time, dancing a fine diplomatic dance inside of a country that is, obviously, in the midst of a fairly nasty civil war. You will have to make decisions on whether you want to help that civilian, on whether you want to engage with the Red Army, or whether you're best to protect yourself, protect your own skin, and get back in that train. And I think that those storytelling elements, in combination with, as I've mentioned, some of those cinematic elements that are far too good looking for what they deserve to be, help to tell a brilliant narrative. Now, I am a bit biased here. As I mentioned earlier, this particular period of history is certainly one that I've been enamored with for a good period of my life. But if I step back from that and take a look at the gameplay, take a look at my scout looking ahead to scout out territory and try and give me an indication of where the enemies are, as I approach in stealth mode, maybe pausing for a tactical view to assign a few different orders if it becomes just a little bit too much for me, and of course gathering all of the resources and intelligence that each level might provide, I think there are some solid real-time strategy and tactics bones here too, each mission playing out slightly differently, in a slightly more dynamic way than the last perhaps. I think that Last Train Home is a really enjoyable experience, and if you've liked what you've seen throughout this video, you can of course check out Last Train Home using my link below, and once again, thanks to THQ Nordic for sponsoring this video. I've been Jumbo Pixel, and I'll see you wonderful people next time. Take care.